As we continue on into wake and sleep cycles, I'm going to just start with some different levels of consciousness that your author goes through at this point, that you can think again about that question of consciousness. And then I'm going to discuss some of the neurochemicals and the brain regions that are involved with these different states of wake versus sleep and different aspects of sleep. He begins this chapter, or this part, talking about different interruptions of consciousness, from coma, where we really don't have any kind of sense of consciousness, or even sleep-wake cycles, to vegetative states where we might see sleep-wake cycles and some small amount of autonomic nervous system response to pain, to minimally conscious state where we definitely see sleep-wake cycles and some even purposive kind of activity. And then to brain death, where we have had enough time where there is no brain activity and we claim somebody to be dead. I have shortened all of that a great deal so we can get right into sleep, but it brings us back to that idea of consciousness. And as we talk about sleep, you might start thinking, what is my definition of consciousness? And do I need to start thinking about there could be different levels of consciousness that we want to consider, and what is being conscious versus being unconscious. Some brain networks that promote waking or wakefulness or arousal. One is the pontomesencephalon. It has some fibers that release GABA, so promoting slow wave sleep and inhibiting behavior, but it also has some fibers that release acetylcholine, dopamine, and glutamate, and it has projections releasing these neurotransmitters that promote waking, acetylcholine, dopamine, and glutamate, that end at the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and in the basal forebrain. The pontomesencephalon is named for the pons, and the mesencephalon is part of the midbrain, so it's part of the reticular formation that contributes to arousal. But as I said, it also has this release of GABA, which is promoting sleep. The locus ceruleus is a tiny but powerful structure, and we have some norepinephrine producing neurons in the locus ceruleus, and it has a wide range of areas that it communicates to, including the thalamus, the hippocampus, and really widely distributed through the cerebral cortex. And the norepinephrine, the locus ceruleus, what's happening with that is that it is contributing to our arousal when something is important. So I usually do that kind of hand clap and see if I wake somebody up, and I'm like, that's getting you, that's giving attention to something that sounds like it's important, right? When we're with somebody, that especially when we're first interested in somebody and we're kind of madly in love, that kind of that's a really important part of our lives, and we're paying a lot more attention and aroused. So we're going to lay that down in memory better. That's really because of activity from the locus ceruleus. Another area is the anterior raphe nuclei. Those neurons produce serotonin, which is another neurotransmitter that's involved in waking and arousal. And it's communicating to the preoptic area of the hypothalamus and the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. So I'm going to go through some of these neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine. Acetylcholine, if you remember very early on, I described this as a widely distributed excitatory neurotransmitter. So it's a very important neurotransmitter for arousal. We have three groups of neurons, areas where the neurons are producing acetylcholine, one in the pons and one in the basal forebrain. These are producing activation and cortical desynchrony. So they are communicating to areas of the cortex. And if you see cortical desynchrony, right, so we're having that kind of neural crosstalk as we are keeping our neurons active. That's the only way I can think of to say that. So a third group is in the medial septum, and it's communicating to the hippocampus. So if we look over at our figures on the right, we have activity, we have release of acetylcholine when we're awake, that's what the AW means, and during REM sleep, in the cerebral cortex, especially when we're awake, whether we are awake and moving around or quiet and awake, which was what the QW means. Acetylcholine is very low. It's not being produced much when it's during slow wave sleep. That's the cerebral cortex, and in the hippocampus as well, we see a similar kind of thing, although now we see even more release of acetylcholine during REM sleep, as we are going to be, during REM sleep, we are going to be consolidating non-declarative memories, but we also see activity or acetylcholine being released in the hippocampus when we are in various stages of being awake. Again, really not when we are in slow wave sleep. Norepinephrine is another neurotransmitter that really controls arousal or influences our arousal. When we wake up in the morning, we see this release, we see a lot of release of norepinephrine, or as this is saying, activity of noradrenergic neurons in the locus coeruleus. So if you remember, norepinephrine is sometimes called noradrenaline. So these are noradrenergic neurons, the neurons that are producing the norepinephrine in the locus coeruleus. This is in the dorsal pons, and they do branch, those axons branch widely, releasing norepinephrine in the thalamus, in the hypothalamus, and in the cerebral, and all through a lot of the cerebral cortex to help us to pay attention to things. And that is going to occur when we wake up, and it's going to slowly dissipate and not be as strong as we are awake for longer and longer. It is very low during slow wave sleep and at floor during REM sleep. So really no activity of these neurons when we are dreaming. Serotonin is another neurotransmitter that's very important for arousal, and it is produced by neurons found in the Raphe nuclei, as I said before. Stimulation of the Raphe nuclei, we see this, it leads to and is caused by locomotion, so movement, and we see in response to it cortical arousal. My family does appear to be low in serotonin, and so one of the things I notice about my mom is that I get sleepy as I'm not moving around, and so I really need to be moving around. And my mom, she just does not sit down. She has to be moving in order to stimulate this serotonin, as our serotonin looks like it really falls off quickly as we are not physically active. So we see, as we are awake and active, we see a lot of serotonergic activity, and that is just slowly going down and down as we're getting less and less awake, and we're going through those stages of sleep where we see slower and slower brain activity. When we are in REM, this is again at floor. And actually, I don't remember if this is the, no, this is from the nuclei of freely moving cats. But one thing that this figure always reminds me to say is that, and to talk about acetylcholine as well. So with serotonin, they can inject someone with serotonin while they are, or a serotonin agonist while they are sleeping, and it will pull them right out of REM sleep if they're in REM sleep. And we see the opposite with acetylcholine. If we get acetylcholine into the brain while someone is sleeping, it will put them right into REM sleep. I did not put the hypothalamus as a clear control of waking and arousal, partly because to some extent it influences arousal, but it also influences sleep as well, right? I mean, it's the hypothalamus, and it is that structure that is allowing for the homeostasis of a lot of aspects of our body. So one of the things the hypothalamus produces in the lateral hypothalamus, so in the tuberomammillary nucleus of the hypothalamus, we see these neurons that produce histamine, and we know that histamines help to keep us awake, and most of us know that because when we take one of those antihistamines like diphenhydramine, that passes the blood-brain barrier, that makes us very sleepy, as histamine is really important for staying aroused and staying awake. Another really interesting neurochemical is orexin. It is sometimes called hypocretin because this was another one of those things that was discovered in two different labs at around the same time. But I think it's typically called orexin, but you might see it called hypocretin out there in the world if you're reading in the field. This is produced in the lateral hypothalamus, and it is very crucial for wakefulness and arousal because almost every brain region involved in wakefulness and arousal are getting excitatory or getting projections from the lateral hypothalamus and are getting orexin to communicate to these areas, including the locus coeruleus, the raphe nuclei, the tuberomammillary nucleus of the hypothalamus, and those neurons in the dorsal pons that are producing acetylcholine. The figure to the right there is showing, I'm pretty sure if I remember these are rats, that when they're doing exploration, we see a lot of activity or production of those of orexin from those orexinergic neurons. We see some, but not as much, just during active waking, some, but even less during quiet waking, and we're really getting towards floor again, almost no activity of those orexinergic neurons when we are in slow wave sleep and when we are in REM sleep, as they actually are going to turn off REM sleep. And this picture is just showing pretty much the same thing that I just said, that all of those neurotransmitters that we've talked about as being really important for arousal, acetylcholine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and histamine. I'm actually going to right now ignore dopamine and glutamate, but they are, those brain areas are getting excitatory activity from these orexinergic neurons in the lateral hypothalamus. One of the authors that I read talks about this as we have a sleep-wake on-off, where waking, sleeping, on-off, where when we're awake, we have that flip-flop is on. We also have an REM flip-flop on-off, where so when we're not in REM is off. And orexinergic neurons are keeping this flip-flop, our waking state, on. They're also keeping our REM flip-flop off. They're keeping us out of REM. Why am I making a big deal about this? Because later when I start talking about narcolepsy, people who are narcoleptic, they have what it looks like their autoimmune system is attacking these orexinergic neurons. They don't have orexin, and so they are not staying awake and aroused. They're not, that wake is not staying on, and there are aspects sometimes of REM sleep that are encroaching on their waking life or on their sleeping life when they're not in REM, when they're just waking up or whatever. And so keeping that's supposed to keep the REM off, and they're just not there in those people. And here I'm just including his Callett's picture of the brain pathways. So some of those excitatory pathways with acetylcholine and histamine and serotonin and norepinephrine, and we can see the pontomesencephalon, the dorsal raphe, and all of those areas kind of communicating out and up to areas of the cerebral cortex, and we should see some effect on the thalamus. In addition, we see the red arrows are telling us about inhibitory activity, which we have not really talked about a lot, but we will talk about gamma aminobutyric acid, and how that is inhibiting behavior and promoting slow wave sleep. And here is just a table that really summarizes very briefly everything I just said about all of those different neurotransmitters and the brain structures from which they originate. Adenosine is another really fascinating neurochemical. Ever since I've learned about adenosine, I have been so interested in it, and I keep meaning to look up more about it. I had never heard of it until I taught this class the first time. But if you know your if you know your stimulants, you know that caffeine is actually an adenosine blocker. So it is a direct antagonist for adenosine. In times of increased metabolic activity, we're converting glycogen into fuel. Okay, and so I've actually had a couple of athletes in my class early on, maybe the second or third time I taught this class, and they would use caffeine before they worked out. They would Red Bull or whatever kind of caffeine they were getting into their system, and I thought, oh, I never remember doing that before running, and that's interesting. But as we're awake, so as we have this prolonged wakefulness, and we're awake for longer and longer throughout the day, because we've been converting this glycogen into fuel, we have less and less glycogen. We also have more and more. We're getting an accumulation of adenosine. And so this accumulation of adenosine inhibits neural activity, and we see the same kind of emotional and cognitive effects. So some irritability and less ability to deal with emotional regulation, as well as cognitive effects like not really being able to pay attention as well and having some memory deficits. We see this as we have this accumulation of adenosine. Okay. We also see that when we're sleeping, during slow wave sleep, astrocytes are going to renew their glycogen stores, and we'll see that adenosine is getting broken down, or we're getting less and less adenosine in the brain. If you notice this word adenosine, this is why this is kind of fascinating to me, and I want to know more how it works, but I keep not looking it up. But it is part of those words, right? Adenosine monophosphate, or what we call AMP, and adenosine triphosphate, or the ATP, that we see as energy for the cells. But that's when it's been, right, when we see those enzymes putting that together to make a larger constituent, as we did with a lot of our, as we saw earlier with the constituents that came together to make neurotransmitters. What's happening when we're sleeping is we're making it so that our brain has less and less adenosine, and we're renewing our glycogen stores, but we all do this at different rates. So I remember in college someone telling me that anybody should be able to live on and do well with 3 to 4 hours of sleep. She could do it. It's what Einstein did. And I thought, honey, you're full of crap. I cannot live off of 3 or 4 hours of sleep. When I try, it is comically horrible. I can't concentrate. I have no memory ability or attention ability, and I'm really just thinking about my bed all day long when I don't get enough sleep. And so when I first taught this class and I learned that we all do this at different rates, some of us might be able to sleep 4 hours a night. That is okay for some people. Others of us need 7 to 9 hours, and some of us need 9 or 10 or 11 hours or more. We do see that relationship with mortality, where the people who are sleeping, regardless of what we're doing and how we're dealing with our adenosine as we're sleeping, the people who are sleeping between 7 to 9 hours, they live longer than the people who are sleeping less or the people who are sleeping more. And finally, as we're going to talk about the inhibition of brain activity and something that promotes sleep, GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, if you remember early on me saying this is a widely distributed inhibitory neurotransmitter, this inhibits synaptic activity. As we're sleeping, our body temperature and our metabolic rate decrease slightly, and we start releasing GABA. And this can be a local phenomenon. Okay, so I give the example of dolphins. I keep thinking I put my dolphin brain in an earlier bunch of slides, but here's our dolphin brain, and I'm going to talk about how important sleep is in the next section. And just note that dolphins have figured this out to where one hemisphere can sleep, get slow wave sleep, so that the really slow in the synchrony where the neurons are inhibited and then communicating at the same time, and then inhibited at the same time, so that they can stay awake enough to go up and get air and breathe. But then the other hemisphere has to sleep. So they trade off, and it's a local phenomenon in an entire hemisphere for the dolphins. They have really cool brains, by the way, if you notice that. That's really cool. We also see People who are lucid dreaming, they appear to have some aspect of their frontal lobes are not receiving the GABA that we see in the rest of the brain, that they are still sleeping, but they have some awareness and they have more control over their dreams. We also see people who are sleepwalking, so again, GABA is influencing parts of their brains, but not all of their brain. And then another really great example is pregnant mothers who, or mothers and fathers of babies, very, very young children, where they are very easily awoken, right? They are part of their brain is staying awake, basically, in order to listen for their children.